Okay, so we're going to factor four terms by grouping. And the way that I know if my polynomial has four terms is I'm going to be able to count my terms based on the addition and subtraction. So this is my first term, and then I got this addition sign. So this is my second term, and then I got this addition sign. So this is my third term, and this addition sign, and this is my fourth term. So all terms are separated by addition and subtraction, and that's how I know how I can count them in a polynomial. And my goal is always to have four terms when I want to do grouping. Okay, so I'm going to just erase these little highlights here so I can show you how to do the math of this. The first thing I want to do, is create. So I want to make two groups. Okay, so I'm going to break this into two pieces here, and I'm going to say, well, this is my first group right here, and this is my second group right here. So I've broken it into two groups. And then I'm going to treat these groups as if they are individual problems. And I am going to look at this first group. So this is 1, this is 2. So I'm going to pull out the greatest common factor from the first one. And then I'm going to pull out the greatest common factor from the second one. Okay. So the way that I find a greatest common factor is I want to look at this first group right here and say, what is the biggest number that will go into or divide into both of those terms? Well, the biggest number that will divide into both of these is 1. 4 can be divided by 1, and 3 can be divided by 1. Then I'm looking at the variable and saying, what is the most amount of x's I can divide out? Well, if I'm looking at this guy right here, there are 2 x's here, so I'm going to write this right here. I got 2 x's right here. And if I'm looking at this guy, I really just have 1 x right here. And I can't divide out 2 x's from this because there's only one of them. But I could divide out 1 x from here because I have 2 of them. I can pull out one of them. So I'm going to divide out 1 x from here and one of those x's from here. Okay, so now I've figured out what my greatest common factor is. I'm going to write it down. I've got a 1x, that's the greatest common factor. And I'm going to do the math where I divide that out and say, well, if I want to divide my 3 by 1, I get 3. And then if I want to divide my x squared by x, well, that's really saying I've got x over x. And I can cancel one of those out, so that leaves me an x. Okay, so that part's done. I have this plus sign right here, so I want to write that down too. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to do my 4 divided by 1. Well, 4 divided by 1 is 4. And then right here I have x over x, and those are both going to cancel out, so those are going to cancel out, and it doesn't leave me any x's at all for right here because they've canceled out. All right, so I have done a couple of my steps in my list, so I'm going to go through and sort of clean this up a little bit. I have done this one right here. I've done this. I've made 2 groups. I factored out the greatest common factor from the first one. Now I want to factor out the greatest common factor from the second group. So I'm looking at this group. And I want to know the biggest number that divides into 6 and divides into 8. And the biggest number that's going to go into both of these, so I'll do this, so they're both going to be divisible by 2. 2 is the biggest number that goes into 6, and 2 is the biggest number that goes into 8. And then I want to know the most amount of x's I can divide in, but this guy right here doesn't have any x's at all. I can't divide an x out of something that doesn't have an x, so I'm not dividing out any x's. I'm going to also write down my third step and say, or the fourth step here. My fourth step is that I need to use the sign of my third term in my greatest common factor. So the sign of my third term is positive. So when I'm doing my greatest common factor here, I'm going to pull out this positive 2. So these things sort of go together. When I'm doing this, I want to make sure I'm using that sign of my third term in my greatest common factor. So I'm going to write down that I'm pulling out a 2. That's my greatest common factor, and then I'll do the math for what's left. Okay, so I want to do my positive 6 divided by 2. Well, that's going to give me 3. And then I still have this x right here, so I'm going to write that down too. I have this x. And I still have this plus sign, so I'm going to write that down. And then I want to know what 8 divided by 2 is, because right here I've got 8 divided by 2, and that's going to be 4. Okay, so I am almost done. I want my fifth step, so I'm going to write this down over here. So the fifth thing I'm going to do, and I should probably check mark these off, I found the greatest common factor, and when I did it, I used the sign of my third term. Okay. The fifth thing I want to do is I want to pull out the greatest common parenthesis group. Well, when I look at this parenthesis group and this parenthesis group are the same. It's common. So I'm going to pull them out. So I pull them out together. I write it down just once. Do not write it down twice because you're pulling out a greatest common factor. And so I'm going to just sort of cross it out saying I've pulled that out. It's gone. And then I look to see what's left, and what's left I write in parentheses. What's left are these two things. So I'm going to unhighlight this, unhighlight that, and say, well, I got this left and that left. And I'm going to say, well, that means I have a 1x and a 2. And I really didn't need this 1. Most people just write x plus 2. And then I'm done. This is going to give me, right here, factors when I factor by grouping.